Welcome back to One Out Racing, people. It's going to be a really interesting one because we're talking about turbo conversions for your Fiat Cinquecento and Seicento. That's right, it's a topic that comes up very often. We get a lot of questions about it. I do personally as well. So I thought it was about time that I made a video to take you through at least as much as I possibly can about turbo converting both of those Cinquecento and the Seicento. Now, disclaimer time. I don't know possibly absolutely everything that you could ever know about turbo converting Cinquecentos and Seicentos, but I've got a lot of knowledge, and I know a lot of people that do as well. That does mean that you may contest some of the stuff that I say, because some of it, let's face it, it's going to be down to opinion. But what I will say is, and throughout this whole video, I will err on the side of caution as far as like safety wise and stuff. So you might think, oh, you could definitely run more boost than that, or maybe you could go for a cheaper one of those, or you should go for a more expensive one of those. But we can only base this based on everything that I know or that I've learned from other people. Another disclaimer is that you are going to have to do a little bit of research yourself as well. You're not going to be able to get to the end of this video series and know absolutely everything that you need to know, because things like turbo choices and what piggyback ECU to go for will be right for you, your budget and your needs. The last disclaimer, that's right, I've got three, is if I'm making the assumption of whatever engine you choose and whatever route you take, that your engine is in tip-top condition. Because if it's not, and you throw a load of boost for it, it's only going to make that worse. You're going to blow up, no one's going to be happy. So with all that said, what can I expect from today's episode? This is a massive topic. It's like anything. Doing a custom turbo conversion on any car is a huge topic. I did try and film this all in one episode, but it got massively confusing, if I'm entirely honest. So I'm going to split it down. So in today's episode, we're going to be covering what engine choices that you've got, their pros and cons, and anything you need to know about actually physically fitting them to your car. We'll go through some gearbox and clutch options as well, because there's actually quite a few of them which are really important that you need to bear in mind depending on what engine that you choose. And then I'll bestow on you any little nuggets of information that I feel will help you choose the best engine to do your turbo conversion in your Cinquecento or Seicento. So, without wasting any more time, let's jump straight in. Right, now let's start off first with the baby of the group, the 900cc engine that you see behind me here. Now, I'm not going to be touching on this engine in massive detail now, purely because I'm actually going to do a build series where I do a budget supercharger conversion on this engine and drop it into my budget track car, the Slug. Now, if you've watched the channel before, you've heard me talk about it. Hopefully it's coming up soon, but I'm definitely going to be mentioning it throughout the video, just because, I personally feel like it's a worthwhile engine. If you've already got this fitted to your car, do not write it off. It's a really simple engine to work on. They're really, really bulletproof, despite the fact they're really old, and it's like a push rod style engine. They're quite low compression from the factory anyway, so I think it would actually take some boost pretty well. It's got an exhaust manifold that actually sits at the back of the engine rather than at the front, which when we get to packaging later on, actually could be a massive advantage. And let's face it, I would always say when you've got an engine in your car already, that's definitely the first one to consider, because you've already got it fitted, you know it fits, and then you can spend your time and effort actually doing the turbo conversion. Now, I did say that I would talk about gearbox options throughout this video, so I'll do those as I go along. Now, the good and bad news about this is you don't really have any options when it comes to gearboxes with this engine. So the Cinquecento came with this engine and the gearbox that it came in, and then the Seicento came with the exact same engine, I believe, with no updates at all, but the gearbox actually does have slightly better synchro mesh in it. That is it. That's the only difference. Now, I've got a Seicento box in my Cinquecento. I will say it does feel better. Generally, it seems to be that it doesn't mind shifting gears fast. But, I mean, to be fair, I might be a little bit biased because the gearbox that was in it before was absolutely shafted. But I will say, do your research. And if you can get a Seicento gearbox, if yours is struggling, go for it. But otherwise, absolutely consider this. And obviously, keep a lookout for my build series if you've already got a 900cc and you like the idea of supercharging it. Right, on to the next engine. Okay, good news is the next two engines that I'm going to be covering, the 1.1 and the 1.2, are so similar that you will notice a lot of times I'll just say the same situation, nothing's different. But there are differences between the two, especially as we get into the further episodes where we start covering things like lowering compression. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's touch on the 1.1 or 1108cc if you want to be precise. Now, the nice thing about this engine is, as I said about the 900cc, it's quite a bomb-proof engine. Cast iron block, it's closed deck, which means it doesn't have waterways around the outside of the cylinders, which means actually for boost, it's pretty good. It's a non-interference engine again, which again means if you snap a timing belt, it doesn't smash the cylinder head to a million pieces. And generally speaking, they can take a hammering. They're still readily available, so you can pick up replacements nice and easy. And obviously, if you're in a Cinquecento or Seicento, there's a damn good chance that the 1.1 is already in there, because they sold, obviously, I imagine, a lot more sport ins than they did anything else. Now there is something to bear in mind. If you own a Cinquecento, nice and easy, you can only get that engine in one option, so that's a single point injection. And as the name suggests, it's only got one injector. In fact, this is a throttle body off of a Cinquecento, and it's just got one injector right in the middle of there. Now, I will tell you the pros and cons of that in a little bit when we get to the episode about fueling. It's both good and bad, but let's not get ahead of ourselves again. Now, if you own a Seicento, things are a little bit different. In the first guise, that's single point injection again, identical engine, but in the facelift, they actually switched to a multi-point injection. Again, that has pros and cons, and we'll touch on those a little bit now and when we get into later episodes. If you're not sure which one you've got, Seicento owners, you could just take your airbox off, and if you've got one injector there, then you know it's SPI. If you've got four in a rail, then it's multi-point injection. But I'll stick a couple of pictures up anyway, because they actually obviously look different, hence the name facelift. On the I believe left-hand side of your screen, and whichever side I'm pointing at now, is a single-point injection, and on the other side of the screen is the multi-point injection. Now, the good news is about both these engines, whether they're SPI or MPI is, there's basically no choice apart from it is just the same engine with different injectors on it. There's no like unicorn engine out there that you need to keep an eye out for. Generally speaking, if it's a sporting engine, it's a sporting engine. They basically make, I'll be near as makes any difference, the same power, even in multi-point injection guys. It was mostly for like emissions and a little bit of fuel economy and stuff like that. Now, the difference here is gearboxes. Now, you actually do have a few different options for gearboxes. On the sporting, like the normal sporting, the gearboxes on those are actually pretty good. They can take anywhere between, I'd say the general consensus, 150 to 180 horsepower, maybe 200 if you're being lucky. Again, it does go down to usage. If you're intending this to hit a drag strip and you're hitting the clutch hard, chances are you're going to kill one. But as a general day-to-day driver and driving it on track, 150 to 180 horsepower from a stock Cinquecento box, they're pretty good. They are quite low geared, and if you're watching this, you probably know that already. But I'd say for a turbo application, it works pretty well. Now, if you own it on a Bath, Seicento, the gearing on those is a little bit lower. Now, they're great for naturally aspirated engines because obviously, if you're lower geared, it helps with the speed. But on a turbo, especially when you start chucking some power through it, that lower ratio can sometimes cause a bit of a problem. It does tend to mean, obviously, your gears are spinning up a lot faster, and that turbo is obviously going to be running out of gears pretty quick. Now, I've learned something fairly recently, actually, that there is one other gearbox to consider, and that is in the 1.1 non-sporting models. So that's like the Sweet. There's some other models they've got it as well. And that, purely on the basis that because they didn't want to make it sportier, it's got slightly longer gearing. I'm talking like only a small bit, but the general consensus is they can actually handle the power that little bit better. And obviously that longer gearing helps when you start obviously making a lot more boost, getting up into the sort of mid 100 horsepower and stuff. That gearing really, really does help. I guess it just spreads the power band across the gears. So that's definitely something worth bearing in mind. Now, there is one other thing to bear in mind with this as well, is that the gearbox on all of these 8-valve engines is almost identical to the one on the later 500R Bath. Now, I'm going to be touching on that engine in a minute. And what that means, though, is that the limited slip differential that you can get in a Fiat 500R Bath will fit your Fiat Cinquecento and Seicento gearbox. Now, there is one piece of information that you need to know about this, is there are some gearboxes that it doesn't fit in and some that it does. And you won't know which one it is until you open it. Now, without going into too much detail on this, effectively, when the diff is in a Fiat 500, the crown wheel, which bolts onto the diff, is actually part of the gearbox, I believe, or at least you don't need to actually, you can take off the gearbox on there and bolt it onto your diff. Now, on a Cinquecento or Seicento, some of the gearboxes, the crown, that pinion wheel will actually unbolt and you can bolt it onto the diff, happy days. Some of them is actually welded onto the actual shaft or onto the gearbox, so you can't remove it and you can't fit an LSD. No one's ever been able to find any information that suggests when they did a bolted crown wheel and when they did a welded crown wheel. I don't know if I've got one in this. I don't know if I've got one in my spare gearbox. But once you actually take the side cover off, it is literally a case of the crown wheel is there, the large actual cog, and you will see bolts or welds. I mean, you're looking to expect to pay probably £700 unless you get it in a group buy for an LSD. So it is not cheap. But obviously, the benefits of that could be massive, and it's definitely worth bearing in mind. Okay, so we've covered the 1.1 and now we're going to cover the 1.2. Now, fundamentally, a lot of the stuff that I've just said is going to be exactly the same. So your gearbox options are pretty much exactly the same as what I've just said. The architecture of the engine is almost identical. It is identical, I should say. It's just got slightly longer stroke and slightly bigger bore in the engine. That's the only difference. But there are a few different engines to bear in mind and keep an eye out for, because there is one in particular that I would consider to be better than all the rest. Now, the horsepower for these engines obviously varies very slightly. There is a Punto 60, which is a single point injection 60 horsepower engine. I'll be honest, I rarely ever see them, so the chances are you probably won't find one anyway. But it's definitely worth bearing in mind. But the rest of them will be multi-point injections, so from the Mark 1, Mark 2 Puntos. And it can vary again on horsepower wise, but what I will say is the only difference being is on the Punto 75. Now these engines are getting a little bit hard to find now, mostly if I'm honest, because of us lot keep stealing them out of Puntos and stuffing them into Cinquecentos and Seicentos. But if you can find one, you know someone who's got one, I would, well, personally would say you should snap it up because it's a wicked engine. Because one, it comes with the 866 cam, so it's called that because it's got 866 stamped on it, and all that basically is a slightly higher lift and duration. So if anyone doesn't know what that means, it effectively opens your valves that little bit more and a little bit for longer. So effectively just making a little bit more power because it lets more air and fuel in. Now you can buy this cam. There are still a few of them kicking about. The prices of them are getting a little bit expensive now, but you could probably pick one up for maybe £100. I've bought them before for like 50. It just depends on who you ask and who's trying to sell it. The other thing it came with as well was a bigger throttle body. So it comes with a 38mm throttle body. Now on the 1.1s, it's usually, I believe it's 32 or 34mm is usually the size that you get. So it's quite a bit bigger. It also comes with a metal inlet. Now, I haven't got a massive problem with the plastic ones. You don't hear a lot of issues with it. But, you know, the metal one's obviously going to be stronger. It's made from aluminium, so it's got good heat dissipation and stuff like that. But that was another plus side for it as well. But the biggest thing that's different, because effectively you can buy all that and bolt it onto a normal 1.2 engine, is that the Punto 75 is the only one that comes with oil squirters under the pistons. So all that does is just squirts oil underneath the piston for cooling. And now they can that idea for any of the future 8-valve engines, but obviously on a turbo, when you're throwing a lot more heat through it, it is a great idea. Now I'm unfortunate because I've got a Punto 75 head on mine, so that's the cam, the inlet and the throttle body, which to be fair I had to buy from Germany to replace it. But my bottom end is just a bog standard Punto 60 bottom end, so I don't have those oil squirts, which is a massive shame. And it's definitely something I'll look to try and find at some point. Other than that, it is effectively the only thing's difference between that and the 1.1. So again, if you've got the option to do it, why not? I mean, if you're going to pull your 1.1 out anyway, then having that extra displacement is absolutely worth having. It's only a little bit more torque, it's only a little bit more power, but when it all counts and said and done, it all counts. I mean, you know, to get an extra 10 horsepower out of an engine sometimes can be quite expensive. So if you start with one with that extra power and torque anyway, why not? Why not indeed, I say. Well, I'm going to be honest here. I am a massive 8-valve fanboy. So that obviously the 1.1 and the 1.2 are both 8 valves. They call them fire engines. Anybody who doesn't know, fire is Fiat's intelligent robotic engine. And the fire engine's been going around for ages. They even carried it on in a slightly bigger form in like the Fiat Stilo. I think it might only actually be the Fiat Stilo in a 1.4. Anyway, that is beside the point. And now over to what I would like to refer to as the K20 of the Fiat world, or at least it's getting that way, is the 1.4 T-Jet. Now, generally speaking, I always say to people, this is the 1.4 16-valve turbo that comes in a Fiat 500R Bath. Now, they do stick them in some other stuff. I think they've got it in some of the lower Puntos, like the GP, and a couple of other cars. But generally, let's just refer to it as the 500 engine, just to stop it getting too confusing. I'm going to go out and say it now. It is a great engine, I would say, for packaging. And how big it is. If I say it's only a 1.4, they come with 150 or 180 horsepower generally. They've brought out so many different versions of it, but generally speaking, your average one you're going to find is going to be 150 or 180 horsepower straight out of the box. The other thing worth bearing in mind as well is there's a few people that have tuned these already on just the stock engine itself, like so the stock block and pistons. So I believe some of the bottom end is already forged, and they're in the kind of low to mid 200 horsepower, which obviously in a small car, if you drop this in a Cinquecento or Seicento, is mental power. Ross Marshall for one of the groups has quite recently finished his, and is made near as makes any difference, sort of in the 250 horsepower bracket. As far as actually fitting them to the car, it's not too bad. Now, there's probably people out there that have done this conversion that are screaming at the screen now saying, oh my God, it's way harder than that. But it isn't too bad. Like the engine mounts are pretty close. Apparently you can use the same engine mounts to get it in your car. So again, it's definitely a viable choice. Cost-wise, the engine of these, you can probably pick one up, I'd say, anywhere between £1,000 and £2,000. Now, most of the decent ones I've seen, with not too many miles, from a rear-ended 500 in the kind of £1,500 mark. Now, obviously, as Fiat keeps on making these, the price of them isn't really increasing yet. But obviously, as they're getting more and more popular, they do sell up quick. So it is quite difficult to get one. It is obviously a more expensive option. Even the Punto 75 engine I mentioned before, you could probably still pick one up if you can find one for sort of anywhere between £300 and £500. And your Bogo 1.2, if it's in decent condition, maybe £200 or £300. They're still pretty cheap. So as a out of the box option, it's obviously more expensive, but it's also making 150 to 180 horsepower straight out of the box. I don't know of any specific fundamental issues with it, but it does come with some bigger expenses. The things that you do need to do to fit this to your car tend to actually come with a decent cost, and I will cover those as we go through the rest. Definitely don't rule it out, and don't let me, because I'm a massive 8-valve fanboy, sway your decision, but 8 valves best. Right, as for gearboxes, at least for the gearbox that comes with the engine, there's little to no choice. So the gearbox in a Cinquecento is a C514, the gearbox in a Fiat 500 Abarth is a C510. I don't know why the number went down, but they are, at least architecturally on the outside, basically identical. But the internals, obviously, of the 500 are massively stronger. Like, they can take the power easily. Now, you've got two choices here. You can, when dropping it into your car, use the 500 gearbox, but you will need custom drive shafts because the outers part of the drive shaft is different. But obviously, that's something worth bearing in mind because the extra expense could be worth it, especially if you're looking to run a lot of power. Or you can actually run the Cinquecento or Seicento gearbox, like any of the gearboxes I've already mentioned, using the same drive shaft. But obviously, you are then limited to power. If you're thinking you're only going to run 150 horsepower anyway, not a massive problem. And again, if you go for one of the non-sporting gearboxes from the Sweets, I think there's some people in Poland that are running those, and they've managed to get sort of 200, 220 horsepower for them, no problem. Personally, if I was going for a 1.4 T-Jet option, I would go with the Abarth box and just get custom drive shafts. Again, you can either get stronger drive shafts made up anyway, so you don't have to worry about that. But it just makes sense to me, if you've got an engine that could make 250 horsepower, to have a gearbox that's going to cope with it straight away, rather than messing about putting a Cinquecento gearbox on it. But if you only intend on keeping the power down, then absolutely consider the Cinquecento gearbox instead. And I think that's a good place to stop the video for now. There will be people out there going, what about the 16 valves? And there are 16 valve versions of the 1.2, and obviously there's a non-turbo 16 valve version of the 1.4. And they are really great engines, especially the 1.2s. I mean, you get probably another 15 horsepower straight off the bat from an 8 valve. They're really revvy and stuff like that. But there's a whole other can of worms as far as wiring and packaging and stuff like that. So I'm not going to cover it in this because we've basically got enough on our plate as it is with the 8 valve, the push rod and the T-Jet. I also feel like with the 1.2 and the 16 valves versions, that's something I kind of like the idea of it being naturally aspirated. So at some point, I'm sure I'll cover something with a naturally aspirated build. But again, don't write it off. Maybe do some research on it if that idea like suits you. But at the minute, we'll leave them out. So the next episode, we're going to go into what's actually needed to get these engines ready for boost, so lowering their compression. And there is a little bit more of a difference than you probably maybe expect. We'll cover fueling upgrades and probably engine management as well, because that all kind of encompasses. And I think that will really, really start to help get it clear in your mind what options are available to you. Then part 3 will be covering effectively everything else. So the actual turbo in bit, so the actual turbo units and the manifolds and all of the packaging and anything else that you need to change effectively on the hardware, on your engine or existing stuff. It's definitely worth knowing. All these little nuggets of information I've picked up doing this turbo over the last few years. But yes, thank you so much for stopping by. Definitely come back for part 2. That should be out in the next few days. It's really going to start getting interesting from here, and hopefully you're going to start getting a proper plan in place and some thoughts in your head about what kind of direction you're going to go with. But that's enough for now. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I will catch you next time.